This is episode 355 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Sign up right now to access bonus history content at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and stay tuned for even more details.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kelly Fitzgerald with the School of Irish, Celtic Studies and Folklore and University College Dublin in Ireland. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
The blessing of candles for the day and for the whole year. Parishioners were obliged to turn up to church with their candles and a penny as an offering. And the blessing in church would see the priest pray over the candles, sprinkle them with holy water before they were lit. And then there'd be a grand procession around the church.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
William Shakespeare never mentions the celebration of Candlemas by name in his works, but we know Shakespeare was involved in the celebration of Candlemas in 1602 from a diary entry written by a man named John Manningham, who wrote about attending a performance of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night on February 2nd of that year, the traditional Feast Day of Candlemas. This 1602 performance took place at Middle Temple Hall, one of the ancient and prestigious training and education establishments for lawyers in the heart of London. But Shakespeare also spent Candlemas in other years with his acting troupe at the royal court, producing plays for Elizabeth I, as well as James I. So what was Candlemas? How was it celebrated? Why was Shakespeare involved in staging plays for the Queen and King? What did those plays look like, and why were they performed on Candlemas? To answer these questions and to introduce us to the holiday of Candlemas and to Shakespeare as a court performer, we are delighted to welcome our guest, historian, and curator at Hampton Court Palace, where Shakespeare himself once performed, Brett Dolman. Brett Dolman is a curator and historian for the 16th and 17th centuries. He works for Historic Royal Palaces, the independent charity who look after the unoccupied royal residences of the Tower of London, Hampton Court Palace, Kew Palace, Kensington Palace, the Banqueting House in London, and Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland. He's responsible for the management, research, display, and interpretation of the history of Hampton Court and the paintings and artworks at the palace. And he has a special interest in the history of royal entertainment, including Shakespeare as a court performer. You can find out more about Brett's work in the show notes for today's episode, along with links to Hampton Court Palace and other resources. Before we dive into our conversation today, I want to let you know that there is bonus visual history that coordinates with our conversation today available for patrons of That Shakespeare Life. If you use the Patreon button on our regular show notes page to log in or join us as a patron, you can expand history content that include images of Hampton Court Palace, copies of the poetry and resources that we're going to mention and note today, along with the primary documents that let us know things about when Shakespeare was performing plays and where. All of these things, along with 16th century portraits, museum artifacts, and more bonus history is all packed into the detailed show notes for today's episode that you can explore while you listen to the history conversation today. Find all these things by using the Patreon button located at CassidyCash.com/episode 355. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/EP355. And now let's dive into the history of Candlemas. Hello, Brett. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello.
Why is the holiday called Candlemas? Are candles actually a particular feature of this celebration?
Well, Candlemas is a Christian celebration of the end of Christmas and Epiphany, the Epiphany season on the 2nd of February. And it's also, though we don't necessarily call it Candlemas, a day when many cultures mark one of those turning points in the year. In this case, the halfway point between midwinter and the beginning of spring. And yes, in both traditions, candles are very often the most important thing. As a religious service, candle mass is a celebratory church communion, which is also known as the Feast of the Presentation of Christ in the Temple, and the Purification of the Blessed Virgin, so Mary, mother of Christ. And according to the Christian New Testament, Mary brought her infant son to the temple in Jerusalem, as was the tradition and according to Jewish law, to be presented to God. Now, Mary would have been ritually purified or churched at the time and welcomed back to the church after giving birth. And in the Gospel of Luke, we're told that at the temple, a prophetess called Anna and a devout, just man called Simeon recognized Mary's child as the Son of God. And Simeon declares that he will become a light to lighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel. So candles become a key part of celebrating this moment in Christ's life, remembering Simeon's words and standing for Jesus Christ as the light of the world. And traditionally, 2nd of February saw candles being blessed by priests in the church as part of the candle mass, leading to candlelit processions outside of the church. But candlelight was a precious, almost magical force through the medieval and early modern period. It was, of course, one of the only ways that people could literally, as well as spiritually, bring light into darkness. So some people lit candles to scare away evil spirits during long, dark winter nights. And by February, in the Northern Hemisphere, with the days getting slightly longer, there is this hope of the extra light, the extra joy, if you like, that spring will bring. So another tradition associated with Candlemas is as a festival of light to herald spring. And many countries, many cultures across the centuries have had similar celebrations at around this time, this important time of renewal and rebirth. The Romans, for example, celebrated Lupercalia. And as often is the case with all manner of other festivals, religious and secular, traditions get elided, sometimes accidentally, but also purposefully, as a way of binding religious faith to established local or ancient customs. As one example, the Virgin of Candles is the patron saint of the city of Puno in Peru. The Candelaria, which takes place on or close to Candlemas every year, is actually one of the largest 3 festivals in the continent of South America. It's a celebration of culture, music and dancing, but has this devotional core where you have the principal image of the Virgin Mary at the heart of the processions and of the performances and the acts of worship. And she carries a lighted candle, as well as 2 doves, which commemorate the presentation in the temple in Jerusalem and Mary's sacrificial offering. So Candlemas is both a significant and important moment in the Christian year, and very often a time of celebration linked to other cultural traditions, often centered around the hope of spring and of renewal, of new light, in other words, represented in all senses by a burning candle.
So how did they select February 2nd as the day they were going to celebrate this?
Well, the date for Candlemas is in most countries the same every year, 2nd of February. It's a fixed point in the Christian calendar that comes 40 days after the birth of Christ, which is traditionally celebrated in the Western Christian church, at least, as 25th of December. So this 40 days is because, according to Jewish tradition, this was the period of time allowed for a woman to recover after the birth of a son before her reintegration into public religious life. It was a time for her to attend the temple, to give thanks through an offering or a sacrifice, and to present her new child to God. But as I've already described, this is also a date halfway through the period between the shortest day of the year and the spring equinox. So this too, again in the Northern Hemisphere, happens on or around the 2nd of February. So the date fits both traditions. It fits the religious calendar and the astronomical one, if you like. And this later tradition has evolved in America, for example, over time, to the idea that the weather on Candlemas is a predictor of whether winter is nearly over. There's a rhyme which is often repeated in various versions. If Candlemas be fair and bright, come winter, have another flight. If Candlemas bring clouds and rain, go winter and come not again. And perhaps most famously in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, a groundhog known as Punxsutawney Phil predicts the weather every 2nd of February. According to legend, if Phil sees his shadow on that date, the groundhog returns to his burrow. and America's in store for 6 more weeks of winter. But if he doesn't see his shadow, the country can expect warmer temperatures and an early spring. And many other cultures have similar superstitions, traditions around Candlemas being a foreteller of spring. And the American Groundhog Day, in fact, has its origins in an earlier tradition established in Germany. So these parallel traditions of thick 2nd of February as Candlemas for Christians and also for many millions of other people who won't necessarily know its religious context.
As a religious church service, what are the main elements of a Candlemas Mass?
Well, Candlemas is one of the oldest feast days of the Christian church, with evidence for its celebration going back to the 4th century. And the practices and details of the service have been adapted over time. But the main elements are still built around a commemoration of the presentation of Christ in the temple and of the revelation of his identity. So the climax of the service will be a Mass or Holy Communion, where Christians remember Christ's sacrifice by sharing bread and wine. And at Candlemas, this is bookended by prayers, by hymns, by read passages from the Bible that focus on the idea of Christ as the light of the world. So most frequently, you'll hear the reported word of Christ himself, as recorded in the Gospel of John, where he says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me shall never walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life." You'll have a sermon too, and that will usually focus on the passage in the New Testament where Simeon recognizes the infant Christ as the Son of God in the temple at Jerusalem. And this is a message for Christians about recognition and purpose, the strength of God displayed in a fragile newborn child. Christ is revealed to be a light for the whole world, and everyone has an opportunity to accept this light or to walk in darkness. And these are key tenets of the Christian faith. And Candlemas is an occasion to remember and reinforce them. Traditionally, the Christian Candlemas service also saw the blessing of candles for the day and for the whole year. Parishioners were obliged to turn up to church with their candles and a penny as an offering. And the blessing in church would see the priest pray over the candles, sprinkle them with holy water before they were lit. And then there'd be a grand procession around the church with the special sung Candlemas canticle, the Nunc Dimittis, which uses Simeon's words from the Gospel to underscore the importance, really, of the occasion and the celebration. Now, we might call this today an immersive piece of drama, seeking to get often illiterate parishioners to understand the meaning of the Christian message by such a vivid, multi-sensory representation of the Christian story. And I use the past tense because this element of Candlemas has dwindled over the centuries, though it does still endure in some church services, some folk customs. But candles are still very much a central part of worship in and outside of church throughout the year. There are specific candles required for important dates across the devotional year, for Pentecost, for Easter, for Advent, as well as candles for the home, for prayer, for lighting in time of need. And the candle has also evolved into a potent symbol of Christ. So for Christian writers and theologians, the candle is a metaphor for Christ's identity. The burning candle represents Christ's duality as God and man. The flame is his divinity, the candle stalk his humanity, the wick his soul.
This service that you're outlining is heavily religious, but with it being called Candle Mass, it's based in Catholic tradition. And I wonder how this service was allowed to be held in this honored position and widely celebrated way when anything Catholic was considered illegal, just to put it mildly, for Shakespeare's lifetime.
Yeah, so as I said, I hinted at the blessing of the candles as part of a Candlemas service in church and the associated immersive theatre, I've called it, of Candlemas processions. That has diminished, and this is particularly the case in Protestant Christian denominations. And this is the kind of ritualistic practice that led to the great rift in the Christian community in the 1500s between Protestants and Catholics. Protestants, as we know, were protesting against what they saw as the corruption and superstitions of the Catholic Church. And they're particularly vocal against the worship of artifacts and images, especially if these false idols, as they called them, were meant to be imbued with magical powers like candles. So in England, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who's the architect of much of the Reformation under Henry VIII and Edward VI, he writes in 1548 that no candles should be borne upon Candlemas Day, nor also henceforth ashes or palms used any longer either. And now this is why practices like the blessing of candles and the ritualistic elements of church service disappear. But as we know, the Reformation, in England at least, was not a straightforward replacement of Catholicism with Protestantism. Henry VIII's Reformation was largely motivated by a simple political cause: the Roman Catholic Church's refusal to grant him a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, to marry his second, Anne Boleyn. And later his son's attempts, Edward VI's attempts at a more Protestant revolution, were then reversed by his half-sister Mary I, and then compromised by their half-sister Elizabeth I within a new Anglican settlement. So by the time of Shakespeare, whilst holding a Catholic Mass was certainly illegal, there were still elements of Catholic liturgy and practice surviving. And the Anglican prayer book retains the date of the 2nd of February as a day to celebrate the purification of the Virgin and of the presentation of Christ, if not with the full paraphernalia of the pre-Reformation Catholic Church. So Candlemas generally is actually still observed as an important date in Christian calendars, with or without the blessing of candles, across Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, even Lutheran and Methodist denominations, just as it was in Shakespeare's day.
So given all of this religious confusion and argument, how did the average person celebrate Candlemas?
Well, if we're talking about the 1500s, 1600s, this was an age where faith was absolutely central to people's lives. So in the earlier 1500s, you might have witnessed a full-scale candlelit procession emerging from the church, eager parishioners clutching their magic candles to take them home to display in their windows and to use for moments of private devotion or as lucky charms. And candles, once blessed in that way, became these powerful charms, these amulets. The blessing prayers explicitly claimed that once lit, they would chase away the devil. And the pre-Reformation church actually did a roaring trade in candle sales. So the lead up to Candlemas was one of their main fundraisers, and explains perhaps why there were so many monks employed as beekeepers to make the beeswax candles. But after the Reformation, this processional and ritualistic element of Candlemas was less widespread. But candles still hold a kind of power for your average devout Elizabethan or Jacobean Christian. Many, no doubt, I think, continued to light candles at home, at and after Candlemas, to bring good luck to a room or to a family event, or to chase away evil spirits during perhaps a frightening storm, or even to cure disease. And other aspects of Candlemas endure. So there might be a pageant or a play with characters playing the roles of Mary and Joseph, of Simeon and Anna at the temple. And the message of Christ lighting the way for his followers is reflected in these localized folk performances that in a way become part of the societal glue for communities across the generations. And this is where religious belief perhaps meets a determination to have fun. And as is often the case, the religious aspects of the day then get confused or joined up with secular enthusiasm for celebration. So Candlemas feasts sometimes have a component linked to the Christian message, or at least to candles, honey perhaps, like beeswax candles, the product of bees, of an apiary. But this was also a last chance to celebrate the Christmas season, with the days getting warmer and longer. The day after Candlemas becomes the day when farmers aim to get out into the fields and start tilling the land, ready to sow the first seeds of spring. So it's perhaps a final opportunity for letting your hair down before the serious, hard outdoor work of the farming year begins. And it also becomes practical in some countries to to link other deadlines and customs to the same date. So in parts of Europe, servants' contracts were paid up and renewed or cancelled. And in Germany, servants get new pairs of shoes. So even when the Reformation rips up the physical landscape and the spiritual certainties of Catholicism across large areas of Northern Europe, beliefs and traditions endure or were reshaped. So Candlemas, like Christmas, becomes, in part at least, a secularized tradition as much as a commemorative Christian ritual.
You've mentioned the association between Candlemas and Christmas a couple of times, but many Christians take down their Christmas decorations by Twelfth night. But there are others who will wait all the way until Candlemas. For Shakespeare's lifetime in the late 16th and early 17th century, what was typical in terms of celebrating Christmas? Was Candlemas considered the official end of the Christmas season, or was that Twelfth night?
Well, for Christians, the season of Christmas lasts 12 days from the celebration of Christ's birth on December the 25th to Twelfth night, the celebration of Epiphany, which is the visit of the Magi or wise men to the infant Christ. But that short period sits in a much longer cycle of devotion, which lasts from Advent, the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas, all the way through to Candlemas, the 40th day after his birth. And these days, in a more secular world, the Christmas season, for most people, might begin even earlier than Advent. Just think of all of those shop windows decked out with Christmas gift ideas and messages in October. For us, perhaps after Christmas, the season swiftly moves on after Christmas Day, with the religious season being eclipsed by New Year celebrations. But in Shakespeare's lifetime, the Christian calendar still reigns supreme, and the extended Christmas season reflects the infancy of Christ, which extends over these 40 days until his presentation in the temple. Oh, and New Year, for most people, wasn't generally celebrated and recognised until March, back in Shakespeare's day. And this longevity of the Christmas season is reinforced by these non-religious traditions, which use the same dates to mark the year for other reasons, like the beginning of spring. So for these reasons, Candlemas Eve, 1st of February, was the most common day for taking down the Christmas decorations back in the early 1600s, which the Christmas decorations might only have gone up, by the way, on Christmas Eve back then, though these would have involved less tinsel and plastic, more religious symbols and winter foliage, things like holly and ivy, also laurel, rosemary. Often, this greenery carried Christian meaning, but it also made sense as everyone was celebrating Candlemas and beginning to think about starting the farming year and looking forward to spring, that it was time to clear house and move forward. There's a famous poem by Robert Herrick, written in the 17th century, which shows the superstitions around a final date for taking down the decorations and how these were fixed around Candlemas, but not all about religion. He says, down with the rosemary and so, down with the bays and mistletoe, down with the holly, ivy, all, wherewith thee dressed the Christmas hall, that so the superstitious find no one least branch there left behind. For look, how many leaves there be neglected, there, maids, trust to me, so many goblins you shall see.
I know the holiday was celebrated at Hampton Court Palace in 1541, but was Candlemas ever observed there after that date, or was it observed during the life of William Shakespeare? As part of your answer to this question, tell us also about the traditional locations for Candlemas celebrations, specifically whether or not the monarchs Elizabeth I and James I, both reigning during the life of William Shakespeare, had particular palaces that they favorited for their Candlemas celebrations.
Yes, well, Candlemas was celebrated at the royal court, wherever the court happened to be. And so this is because the court in Tudor, Elizabethan, Jacobean England was peripatetic. It moved around. It moved from palace to palace, or even in Elizabeth I's case, often between her councillors and top nobles' country residences. This would mean they would end up paying for much of the cost. So the court, which might be a few hundred or even a few thousand people, depending on the occasion, needed food and drink. And after a few weeks, the local suppliers and countryside were exhausted, and the palace itself filthy and in need of a good clean. So the court moved on. In 1541, as you say, Henry VIII spent Candlemas at Hampton Court, where he took part in a service in the chapel. Other years, other Candlemasses were spent at Richmond, at Windsor, other palatial residences owned by Henry VIII, but mostly at Westminster Palace in central London, or at Greenwich, slightly to the east. In fact, the court didn't spend Candlemas at Hampton Court again until after Henry's death. The progress of the later Tudor monarchs is incompletely recorded, but we do know that Elizabeth I spent Candlemas at Hampton Court in 1574, in 1576, in 1577, and on each occasion, she saw plays as part of the holiday entertainment, presented in 76 and 77 by the Lord Chamberlain's men, though this is an earlier version of the players' troupe. Shakespeare's still a boy in Stratford at this decade. So as we've seen, Candlemas was the end of the extended Tudor Christmas and Epiphany season. And at court, this meant that Candlemas followed a really busy 2 months of important religious and state ceremony, as well as state business. You have to remember that the Tudor government travelled with the court wherever it went. In fact, it was the court. But this is also a season of parties, of feasts, of entertainments, as well as the extravagant gift-giving ceremonies of January the 1st, when everyone queued to outdo each other in their desire to curry favour with the monarch. Elizabeth I regularly received thousands of lavish gifts each year, everything from jewellery, silk stockings, to toothpicks made of gold. There's mercifully a bit of a gap in the entertainment calendar, at least between Twelfth Night and Candlemas, but Candlemas is still seen as part of this extended Christmas court season of festivities, and the entertainments are often produced and paid for as part of the same package. So this all continued under Elizabeth I's successor, James VI of Scotland, who becomes James I of England in 1603, when we know that the king celebrated Candlemas with a visiting embassy from Florence at Hampton Court in 1604, and at Whitehall Palace in central London on other occasions.
In 1602, John Manningham records in his diary that he saw a production of Shakespeare's play Twelfth Night on February 2nd. In fact, this record is considered the first known performance of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. Brett, was it a traditional part of Candlemas celebrations in the early 17th century to put on a play?
Yeah, certainly at court, and as I've mentioned, also elsewhere too. Wherever anyone had the venue or the resources to organise performances, because it was a holy day and a celebratory occasion for everyone. And as you say, we know that Twelfth Night was performed on Candlemas at Middle Temple Hall. The lawyer, John Manningham, who was there, recorded in his diary, he says, "At our feast we had a play called 12 Night, or What You Will, much like the Comedy of Errors." We don't know why necessarily, but it was a new play, and first performances were sometimes produced for the private stage before being aired publicly at the public theatres. It would be nice to believe that this was the play performed by Shakespeare's company on Twelfth Night 1601, so a year before, in front of Elizabeth I and her guest, who happened to be Duke Orsino of Bracciano in Tuscany, given that there's a Duke Orsino in the play, of course. But there's no evidence to support this. So most people agree that the first performance of Twelfth Night was in 1602. And the subject matter of Twelfth Night is quite apt for the celebratory mood of revelry and of looking forward to the spring. Twelfth Night was a day when societal norms were inverted and chaos, or misrule, as it's called, reigns, perhaps a bit like a modern New Year's Eve, drinking and feasting, dressing up, pranking. And back at the royal court, comedies like Twelfth Night were very popular, along with a whole range of dramas, of tragedies and romances, penned by Shakespeare and other authors and performed by more than one acting troupe. And even the Queen, Elizabeth I, liked to laugh, we're told, amidst the serious business of state and religious ritual. Shakespeare himself says in Love's Labour's Lost, that a play we know was performed at Christmas for Queen Elizabeth at Whitehall Palace. He says, "I see the trick on't, here was a consent, knowing aforehand of our merriment, to dash it like a Christmas comedy." Now, we don't often know, however, whether the jokes went down well or how the plays were received. There's an example, a rare example in the state papers from the 1580s, of how the actor and clown, Richard Tarleton, he's also a musician, a dancer, a writer, a fencing expert. He kept goading from the stage the Lord Chamberlain so much that the Queen has him removed because he was making her laugh too much. On the other hand, we have notes in the accounts back in 1574 at Hampton Court, which mentioned how a masque of ladies with lights being the 6 virtues was prepared but not shown because of the tediousness of the play that night that they'd already had to sit through. We don't know what this was, but it was produced by Mr. Mulcaster's children. And very often we don't know the names of the plays performed, unfortunately, as the only surviving documents sometimes only record how many plays were produced over a court season, not what they were. It's all about the money. That's what the accounts will tell you, how many plays, therefore how much money is paid to the actors. We know that Elizabeth I saw a play at Candlemas at Richmond Palace, just outside London, in the very last year of her reign, 1603, again produced by Shakespeare's Lord Chamberlain's men, but we don't know what this was. And after that date, February 1603, playing was banned because of the Queen's last illness. And then plays disappear even from the public stage over the summer because of a recurrence of the plague.
When Elizabeth I died in 1603, Shakespeare's company becomes the King's Men under the new King, James I, who officially patronizes this play and company. Do we know anything more about Shakespeare as a court performer under James I? And what did it mean? What did it shift for him to become a King's Man?
Well, all the King's Men were made grooms of the chamber. This is a title that meant that you were a servant of the royal household. Now, this offers the players court protection, patronage, though they'd still have to earn their living on the public stage. But it meant that the King's Men received payments for court performances and for taking part in other ceremonial events like the Royal Triumphal Procession of 1604. It also meant that they had an important role in projecting the image of the king through the quality of entertainment on offer, and more directly in the content and messages of the plays chosen for performance. So during the plays staged in the Great Hall at Hampton Court over the Christmas season of 1603 until Candlemas of 1604 for James I, the king would have sat on a raised platform on a chair of state under a canopy opposite the stage itself. And we know this because the records that do survive are all to do with how much money was paid to the various royal departments for setting up stages and trestle seating, terrace seating for the audience, as well as carefully partitioned boxes for the VIPs, and for providing costumes, props and furniture, lighting, and of course for paying the actors. Andrew Kirwin, who's the paymaster for the Office of Works, authorised payments to carpenters and joiners at Hampton Court for making of the stage new in the hall for Candlemas Day, but also for taking down of a standing and setting up the same at the court door for the Queen. That's Anna of Denmark, wife of James I, to watch the running at the ring. And that kind of gives you a glimpse into the range of entertainments on offer at Candlemas at court. Running at the ring is a tilting sport. Horsemen with lances would ride towards a small ring suspended from a pole and attempt to carry off the ring on their lance. And Shakespeare's part of this. So he's there with the King's Men between 1603 to 1604. We know he receives new liveried clothes for the festivities. And we know how many plays the King's Men were contracted to perform over that season. But back to James's raised platform, I just wanted to say that this not only gave him the best view of the performance, but also made sure that the king was in full view of the rest of the audience. And it's the king and often the rest of the royal family who are as much part of the performance as the actors. And James knows this, and he says as much in his own handbook to kingship, written for his eldest son, Prince Henry, Basilicon Doron, in 1599. He says, the king is as one set on a stage, whose smallest actions and gestures all the people gazingly do behold. And Shakespeare's plays were part of this performance of kingship too. Some carry signs that they're written as much for court as they were for the theatre. The king's playwright had an important role in portraying James, indirectly but recognisably, in a favourable light. In Measure for Measure, for example, it's the Duke's intervention that saves the day. And the implied message is that royal justice, tempered with mercy, it is supreme, it's fair. And this kind of messaging would have been understood by the most important members of the audience, including at Candlemas 1604, the Florentine ambassador, who's there as the special guest of James I. There's evidence too that the king was a receptive audience. He seems to have so enjoyed a February 1605 production of Merchant of Venice at Whitehall that he orders a repeat performance. He also rewards his players with additional payments outside the court season if plague closes the public theatres. And sometimes Shakespeare deals with difficult subject matter, even at court. The performances of his new play King Lear at the Christmas court of 1605 might have occasioned the odd raised eyebrow, I think, in the audience. This is a play that deals with the rights of kingship and the division of a kingdom at a time when Parliament and King were debating the union of Scotland and England. But the actor's role was in a sense to raise issues that were being debated anyway and to provide a royal response, whilst packaging the whole thing as a work of entertainment. And court productions were in any case censored by the master of the revels, Edmund Tilney, before they could be performed. You've got the dramatist Thomas Hayward writing in 1612 that our court plays have in late days yearly rehearsed, perfected and corrected before they come to the public view of the prince and the nobility.
Did Shakespeare remain a king's playwright for the rest of his life? Were his works continued to be performed at Hampton Court after Shakespeare died, even perhaps for Candlemas?
Well, Shakespeare, the King's Men, and plays in general remained in demand throughout James I's reign, along, I should say, with a more spectacular and more overtly political court masque. They provide an important contribution to the drama, the spectacle, the propaganda of the Stuart court. And the King's Men presented the larger proportion of the 421 plays performed at court during James's reign. It's an average about 19 plays a year compared to 6 for Elizabeth I. And these included Candlemas performances, not necessarily of Shakespeare's plays. The Candlemas performance at Whitehall in 1605 was Ben Jonson's Every Man in His Humour. And on Candlemas 1607, again at Whitehall, the court watched a play by Barnaby Barnes called The Devil's Charter. Some of the costs for this latter performance survive, by the way. These include payments for lights, wire, ropes to hang the lights, paint for stage furniture, fuel, canvas, locks and keys, feathers, ivy and bay for decorations, boat hire to move the actors and some of the other members of the court in and out of the palace, and a new door for the music house. So plays were a big thing and very much part of the expected entertainments at court and with their own organised production teams. As Shakespeare himself has Theseus, the Duke of Athens, declare in A Midsummer Night's Dream, which we think, by the way, had its first performance in the Hampton Court Great Hall on New Year's night 1604. Where is our usual manager of mirth? What revels are in hand? Is there no play to ease the anguish of a torturing hour? And I think, in fact, we should remember James I's reign for two hugely important literary achievements. The King James Bible was published in 1611 as a result of a conference held at Hampton Court in January 1604 in and around the drama of court entertainments during the Christmas season, and the first folio of Shakespeare, published in 1623. And after that, Hampton Court continued to be a place for royal entertainments through to the 1730s. The Great Hall was turned into a theatre by George I in 1719, the furniture for which was only removed at the end of the century. And by this point, the royal family had stopped using Hampton Court as a residence, but the Grace and Favour residents who occupied the old courtier apartments at the palace put on their own shows. And I should say that even today, Historic Royal Palaces commissions drama and live programming for our visitors. And there's a music festival at the palace every year, though I'm afraid we don't still keep the tradition of performing on Candlemas.
This is all very exciting, and it's really fun to consider how many times Shakespeare was not only performing plays for Candlemas, but his visits to Hampton Court Palace. I know we would love to learn more about this topic, as well as to be able to visit Hampton Court Palace and see these places where Shakespeare helped monarchs celebrate the end of the Christmas season. Brett, as an expert historian and curator at Hampton Court Palace, what are your favorite books or resources you can recommend for us if we're new to this part of history and want to learn more?
So 20 years ago, we celebrated the 400th anniversary of James's first English Christmas court at Hampton Court. And we put on Shakespeare plays and an exhibition about the drama and debate of that court season when the King's Men were performing. And you also had the Hampton Court Conference where the future of the Church of England was debated. And I wrote a little book called Drama and Debate at the Court of James I. And that's, I think, quite a nice little good introduction to Shakespeare as a court performer. There's a much bigger book on the same subject by Alvin Kernan called Shakespeare, the King's Playwright, which expands on the known or conjectured performances of Shakespeare between 1603 and 1613. On Candlemas and the story of the celebration, you can find out more by reading books like Ronald Cutton's Station of the Sun or Eamon Duffy's vivid book on popular religion in England in the 15th and 16th centuries, The Stripping of the Altars.
We will link to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode so you can find exactly what Brett's recommending and get there in an expeditious way. So make sure you check out the show notes to find those. Now, Brett, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
I'm tempted to ask for Wikipedia to be printed out, as I've kind of come to understand that I'm driven by a never-ending hunger for data and information and lists. But assuming that I'm restricted to one book, I might ask for Bob Stanley's Yeah, 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 which is a history of pop music and begins and bears being dipped into and reread again and again. And pop music's probably my other main love alongside history. So I'd need that with me.
I think that's a very fun selection. I think you're the first person to select a history of pop music here on our show. So that's delightful too. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, at Hampton Court, we're often driven by our Tudor-loving audience, as the palace is principally celebrated as the home of Henry VIII. And we've just finished a major project to reopen the Wolsey Rooms, which are one of the oldest surviving parts of Hampton Court, built for Thomas Wolsey, Henry's right-hand man and owner of Hampton Court through the 1520s. And these rooms haven't been open since 2019. So we've represented them with some wonderful artworks from the Royal Collection, but also to tell the story of what the whole world looked like across the whole of the 1500s. So it's a little bit of a backdrop to Shakespeare and kind of the thing that you do on this wonderful podcast as well, giving a bit of context to the wider world for Henry VIII in this case and for Thomas Wolsey. And next up, we'll be looking at the later royal apartments at the palace, so built for William III in 1700. But there's always live programming and other events at Hampton Court too, and Shakespeare will return, no doubt, in the not too distant future, perhaps in the Great Hall where the King's Men performed in 1603. So people can check out Historic Royal Palace's website for all the latest news and plans. You can join as a member, which is possibly the best way to visit not just Hampton Court, but also our other palaces like the Tower of London and Kensington Palace too.
It is a wonderful way to get to see these literal living pieces of history. And I can't wait. I sincerely hope that there are Shakespeare performances done at the Great Hall. I will be first in line to come and see that. Thank you so much, Brett, for being here and taking us through the history of Candlemas, helping us understand this holiday and its place in the life of William Shakespeare. I appreciate you being here to share this with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
All of the bonus resources we talk about today, including direct links to the resources about Candlemas and the court performances and Hampton Court Palace that Brett mentions for you today, are all packed into the show notes for today's episode. You can find these at CassidyCash.com/episode 355. While you're there, you can also click the Patreon button to expand the bonus visual history associated with today's show. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 355. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.